The year was 2236. Amidst the swirling silence of the void, the Harbinger, an Earth diplomatic cruiser, drifted toward the edge of the Rethra system. Alec Kane, a seasoned diplomat with an edge honed by years of tense negotiations, stood on the observation deck, staring into the abyss. Stars glinted like distant, cold eyes beyond the vast asteroid field that encircled a dying red sun. It should have been a simple negotiation, just another attempt to sway the enigmatic Raytari turret's cause in the brewing interstellar conflict. But Alec felt a chill that went beyond the freezing temperatures of the ship's hull. Something about the emptiness surrounding them, how the shadows clung to the drifting rocks, made his gut twist. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was nerves. After all, it wasn't every day one negotiated with a race as unpredictable as the Raytari, whose ancient knowledge and eerie silence made them a power to reckon with. He adjusted his collar, tugging at the stiff fabric of his diplomatic uniform, and turned away from the viewport, heading toward the landing bay where his team waited. But just as he reached for his comms device to confirm their approach vector, the signal from the Raytari vanished, replaced by static. The abrupt cutoff made Alec pause, frowning at the interference. He could feel the tension tighten in his chest as he called for a status update, but the only response was the hiss of dead air. Suddenly, the lights on the landing bay console flickered, and the ship shuddered with the groan of metal like a whisper from the shadows. The deck shifted under Alec's feet, and his hand instinctively went to the sidearm, hidden beneath his diplomatic jacket. He looked around, scanning for any sign of his crew, but the bay was empty. Then he saw her. A figure moved through the darkened edges of the bay, stepping out from behind a row of storage crates. Her skin glowed faintly in the dim light blue, like the deep sea on Earth, marbled with darker veins that pulsed gently beneath the surface. It shimmered, reflecting the overhead lights in a way that seemed both beautiful and otherworldly, almost like she was carved from living sapphire. Her eyes, too, were unnerving, a deep, crystalline violet that caught the light, making them seem to burn with their own inner flame. Alec froze, his hand inching toward his weapon, but the sight of her stilled his breath. She was tall, willowy, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Tight black armor clung to her lithe frame, designed for stealth and efficiency, revealing glimpses of the powerful muscles beneath. He had never seen a Raytari like her. No, she was different, not just alien but deadly. A blade gleamed at her side, curving like a predator's claw. Kira. The name came to him in a sharp intake of breath, as he recognized her from intelligence briefings, a syndicate assassin, a whisper on the lips of dying men. He had thought her a myth, a ghost haunting the shadows of interstellar politics. But here she was, a living, breathing threat, and his heart began to pound as he realized why the Raytari signal had vanished. She had come for him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a low, resonant murmur that cut through the stillness, echoing slightly off the metallic walls. There was a strange, lyrical quality to her accent, as if she spoke the Terran language as an afterthought, her tongue made for different sounds. "And yet, here I am," Alec shot back, trying to keep his voice steady. He lifted his hands, palms out, trying to buy time. "Diplomat Kane, I'm here for." Before he could finish, she moved a blur of motion faster than his eye could track. One moment, she was several paces away. The next, her blade was pressed against his throat, cold against his skin. Her other hand pinned his arm to his side with a grip that was impossibly strong. He swallowed, feeling the edge bite lightly into his flesh, and cursed himself for not drawing his gun sooner. "Your words mean nothing here," she whispered, her breath ghosting over his ear, warm against the chill of the bay. Alec caught the faintest scent of something floral, something that reminded him of Earth's jasmine, mixed with the ozone tang of alien air. Alec tried to focus, summoning the calm that had seen him through countless negotiations. "You don't have to do this, Kira. The Syndicate." "The Syndicate," she hissed, cutting him off, her eyes narrowing, her lips curled in a humorless smile. "They want you dead, Earthman. That's all that matters." But there was a hesitation in her grip, a flicker of something in her eyes, a crack in the icy mask she wore. Alec felt a surge of hope. He shifted slightly, pressing just enough to test her resolve. "Maybe it's not all that matters. If they sent you to kill me, why are you talking?" Kira's jaw tightened, and Alec saw the tension ripple through her, the way her body stiffened as if she was fighting an internal war. She pressed the blade harder, making his breath hitch. For a heartbeat, he thought she might do it, slice his throat and leave him bleeding on the cold metal deck. But then, A tremor rippled through the ship, a shuddering groan that sent vibrations up through their feet. Red lights flashed along the bay walls, and a low alarm began to hum a syndicate warship's approach. Too close, too fast. Kira's eyes darted upward, her expression turning sharp with alarm. "They're early," she murmured, almost to herself, and for the first time Alec heard uncertainty in her voice. Her grip loosened just enough for him to push back, and he took his chance. He wrenched his arm free, shoving her off balance. She stumbled, and he managed to grab her wrist, twisting her arm behind her. Kira's face twisted in a snarl, but there was no malice in it, just something desperate, wild, as if she was fighting not just him but herself. She swung her blade, and Alec barely managed to block, feeling the force of her strength. She spun free of his hold, crouching low with a feral grace, ready to strike again. But then the bay's outer door buckled inward, the syndicate ship's magnetic clamps digging into the hull, sending a screech through the air. Kira glanced back, a flicker of fear passing over her expression, quick, but unmistakable. Alec saw it, and the realization dawned. "They're not here for me, are they?" he said, his voice low, cutting through the chaos. "They're here for you." Kira's eyes met his, and for a moment there was something raw in them, something that wasn't cold or calculated. She clenched her jaw, but then she stepped back, retracting her blade with a swift, smooth motion. "You think you're clever, Earthman," she said, her voice like a growl. "Fine. But if you want to live through this, you'll follow me." She turned, sprinting toward a secondary shuttle bay, and Alec hesitated only a moment before running after her, leaving the shattered negotiations and his mission behind. The Syndicate's warship pierced through the atmosphere outside, its cannons charging to fire. Alec felt a rush of adrenaline and fear, but beneath it, a strange thrill, a sense that, whatever this was, it was only the beginning. They dove into a small, outdated shuttle, the hatch slamming shut behind them, just as the first barrage hit the Harbinger, sending the cruiser into a tailspin. Kira's hands moved with practiced speed over the controls, and Alec strapped himself into the co-pilot's seat, breathless, trying to ignore the wild beating of his heart. As the shuttle roared to life, Kira glanced sideways at him, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. "Don't think this means you're safe," she said, her tone cutting but carrying an edge of uncertainty. "This is survival, nothing more." "Right," Alec replied, leaning back as the shuttle shot into warp, hurtling away from the Syndicate ship, leaving the Harbinger behind as a fading echo in the stars. But as the darkness of space wrapped around them, Alec couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Kira's reasons, fate had bound them together, pulling them into a dance that neither of them could control. And in her violet gaze, he glimpsed a question, one that neither of them yet knew the answer to. The small shuttle hurtled through the darkness of space, leaving the shattered ruins of the Harbinger behind. Stars streaked past like shards of distant glass, painting the void with pale light. Alec Kane, struggling to steady his breath, cast a sideways glance at Kira, the alien assassin who had, against all odds, spared his life. Her hands danced over the control panel with a practiced efficiency, her expression set in rigid concentration. She was an enigma, dangerous, unpredictable. Her skin shimmered with a deep, oceanic blue, marbled with veins of darker indigo that pulsed gently under the shuttle's dim lights. Alec tried to focus on their situation, but his mind kept drifting to the strangeness of their unlikely alliance. Minutes ago, she had a blade to his throat. Now, they shared the fragile silence of survival. Alec broke that silence first, his voice low and measured. "Why didn't you kill me when you had the chance?" Kira, his words carried a challenge, but beneath it, there was curiosity and need to understand the person who had so quickly become his only ally. Kira's hands hesitated over the controls, her jaw tightening. She didn't meet his eyes. "Does it matter?" she replied, her tone clipped. "I need you alive, Earthman. That's all you need to know." Alec narrowed his gaze, studying her profile as she focused on piloting. He sensed something beyond her pragmatic answer, a flicker of uncertainty, a shadow of emotion that didn't fit with the image of a cold-blooded assassin. "It matters to me," he pressed, his voice softer now. "You're not just following orders anymore, are you? So what changed?" Kira's violet eyes finally turned toward him, flashing with irritation, but Alec thought he saw something else beneath her anger, something raw, unguarded. "The Syndicate sent me to kill you," yes, she admitted, her voice carrying an edge of bitterness. "But they didn't expect me to come back, no matter the outcome. They don't trust me anymore. Maybe they never did." Alec felt a chill slide through him. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made their situation feel even more precarious. "So they sent you on a suicide mission," he said, keeping his voice steady, trying to understand her better. "Why would they turn on you after all this time?" Kira's gaze grew distant, as if she were looking beyond the metal walls of the shuttle into a past that still haunted her. "They see me as a loose end," she said softly, barely more than a whisper. "A weapon that's no longer useful. Maybe they think I've grown. Too curious about what's outside their control." She clenched her fists, as if the admission pained her. Alec watched her, a mix of sympathy and unease knotting in his chest. He knew the dangers of power structures like the Syndicate. They valued loyalty until they didn't, discarding lives when they became inconvenient. But he saw a different struggle in Kira's eyes, one that went deeper than just survival. Before he could probe further, a sudden tremor rattled through the shuttle, drawing their attention back to the present. Kira cursed under her breath and adjusted the trajectory, guiding them toward the looming shadow of Arcus 9, an abandoned mining colony drifting in the shadow of a gas giant, its broken silhouette barely visible against the swirling clouds of orange and gold. Alec recognized the place immediately. He had been here once, years ago, during a mission to assess the remnants of the mining operations. Back then, Arcus 9 had been a decaying ruin, a labyrinth of rusted corridors and flickering lights. But it had offered a refuge to those with nowhere else to go: exiles, rogues, and desperate souls hiding from the reach of the law. Kira guided the shuttle into a landing bay with a thud, the metal groaning as they touched down. Alec unstrapped himself, feeling the weight of his sidearm against his hip as he followed Kira to the exit hatch. She paused for a moment, casting a quick glance back at him, her expression wary. "Stay close," she said, her voice sharp. "This place isn't as empty as it looks, and the people here don't ask questions, they just take what they want." Alec nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. They stepped out into the docking bay, the chill air stinging against their skin. The chamber was vast and silent, filled with the skeletal remains of machinery long abandoned. The air smelled of rust and stale oxygen, carrying the echoes of a place that had been left to decay. Kira moved ahead of him, her steps as silent as a shadow. Alec followed, keeping his senses alert as they made their way deeper into the complex, through corridors lined with broken lights and crumbling walls. The place felt like a tomb, a relic of a forgotten era, where whispers of lost voices lingered in the darkness. They reached the old command hub, a dome-like chamber at the heart of the colony. A few consoles still flickered with faint light, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Kira approached one of the terminals, plugging in a data chip with a swift motion, her hands working over the controls. Tracking Syndicate signals, she explained tersely, her eyes fixed on the holographic display that flickered to life. "I need to know how much time we have before they catch up." Alec watched her, sensing an opening to learn more. "You chose this place because you've been here before, haven't you?" he asked, leaning against a nearby console. "Why? What's Arcus 9 to you?" Kira didn't look at him, but he saw her shoulders tense. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a hint of something deeper. "It's a place for people who don't belong anywhere else," she said, her tone heavy with unspoken meaning. "People like me." Alec heard the weight behind her words, a hint of regret she hadn't meant to reveal. He stepped closer, trying to see past the mask she wore. "You're not just a weapon, Kira," he said quietly. "You had a life before the Syndicate. What happened?" For a moment she was silent, the holographic light casting strange shadows across her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough, as if she were dragging the words from a deep, painful place. "They took me when I was a child," she said, her violet eyes distant. "Erased who I was, replaced it with." This she gestured to herself, her expression twisting with bitterness. "But sometimes I remember fragments, pieces of a world where the sky wasn't just black, where I wasn't just a blade waiting to be drawn." Alec felt a pang of something like sympathy, no, deeper than that. A shared sense of loss, of being caught between worlds. And now he asked, his voice barely more than a murmur. "What do you want, Kira?" She glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, as if no one had ever bothered to ask her that question. But before she could answer, the terminal beeped, drawing their attention back to the display. Kira's expression darkened as she read the data. "They're closer than I thought," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We have less time than I hoped." Alec felt a jolt of adrenaline, but he met her gaze with a steady determination. "Then we'd better come up with a plan," Fast. Whatever comes, we face it together. For a moment, Kira's expression softened, and he thought he saw a hint of something like gratitude in her eyes and acknowledgement of the fragility of their alliance. She nodded, a small, reluctant gesture. Together, then she said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty, "But don't think for a second that I'm trusting you." Alec managed a faint, wry smile. "Fair enough," he replied, but as they turned back to the terminal, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something that went beyond survival. And in the darkness of Arcus 9, amidst the ghosts of forgotten lives, they began to sense the stirrings of a bond that neither of them had expected. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. And as the shadows of the past loomed closer, both Alec and Kira realized that whatever future awaited them, it would be shaped not only by the danger closing in, but by the fragile thread of trust that bound them together. The skeletal halls of Arcus 9 echoed with the hum of ancient machinery, their whispers mingling with the breaths of two unlikely fugitives. Alec and Kira moved through the shadows, guided by the faint light of half-functioning terminals, their footsteps the only sounds disturbing the eerie quiet. The deeper they ventured, the more the silence felt alive, like it was watching, waiting. Alec kept his hand close to the holster on his hip, glancing toward Kira, who navigated the labyrinth with unsettling familiarity. They arrived in a chamber that had once been the colony's communications hub, a circular room with a high, domed ceiling and broken consoles that arched around them like the ribs of a decaying beast. Kira set to work immediately, tapping commands into a battered terminal that crackled under her touch. Alec watched her, arms crossed, feeling the weight of unasked questions pressing against his ribs. It had been 2 days since their escape from the Harbinger, 2 days of uneasy silence and hurried survival. They had scavenged supplies from the empty corridors, water purifiers, ration packs, ammunition, all remnants of a place that had been abandoned to the cold grip of space. But the ghostly atmosphere of Arcus 9 was starting to fray Alec's nerves, and the fact that Kira seemed so at home here only made her more of a mystery. "You knew this place well enough to bring us here," he said finally, breaking the silence that had settled between them like a heavy shroud. "Did the Syndicate hide out here too?" Kira's fingers stilled over the controls, her expression hardening for a moment. But then she sighed, a sound that seemed too human for someone who had spent so long suppressing those impulses. "The Syndicate doesn't care about places like this," she replied, her voice carrying an edge of bitterness. "Too far from the core systems, too full of those they'd rather forget." She gestured to the crumbling walls around them, to the rusted consoles that blinked weakly in the shadows. "Arcus 9 is a graveyard. It's where they send the mistakes, the ones who aren't perfect enough for their cause. They left this place to rot long before you ever knew it existed." Alec frowned, stepping closer to the terminal. "And yet, you came back," he said, searching her face for any sign of emotion beneath the cool mask she wore. "Why?" Kira's lips twitched into a small, bitter smile. "Maybe I felt at home among the dead," she replied, turning back to her work. Her tone was casual, but Alec heard the pain beneath it, the kind of pain that came from being discarded, from carrying the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. He studied her in the dim light, seeing the faint lines of exhaustion etched into her features, the tension in her shoulders. Despite her lethal skills, there was something almost fragile about her in this moment, as if Arcus 9 had stripped away the layers she used to protect herself. He wondered how many people had ever seen her like this, unguarded, without the edge of a blade between her and the world. But before he could press further, the terminal beeped, drawing their attention to the flickering screen. Kira's eyes narrowed as she scanned the data, her expression growing darker with each passing second. "They're closer than I thought," she muttered, her voice tight with urgency. "The Syndicate is sweeping through the outer rings of the sector. It's only a matter of time before they pick up traces of our warp trail." Alec felt a chill settle in his chest. He leaned over the screen, taking in the streams of coordinates and coded signals. "How long until they find us?" he asked, already calculating their next move, the possible escape routes. Kira's jaw clenched, and for a moment he saw something raw in her eyes, fear, and beneath it, a flicker of something more vulnerable. 2 days, if we're lucky," she said quietly. "Less if they deploy scouts." She shut off the terminal, plunging them back into the dim glow of emergency lights. For a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of their situation settling heavily between them. Then Kira moved past him, her expression once more guarded, as if she had let slip too much. "Come on," she said, her voice brisk. "We need to find a place to rest. You look like you're about to pass out, Earthman." Alec bristled at the jab, but he couldn't deny the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He followed her down a winding corridor, deeper into the colony's underbelly. They reached what had once been a storage area, now a cold, empty space lined with discarded crates and broken equipment. Kira scouted the perimeter, checking for any hidden threats before she finally allowed herself to sit, resting her back against the wall. Alec dropped down beside her, stretching out his sore muscles. For a while they simply sat in silence, the hum of distant machinery the only sound between them. But as the minutes dragged on, the silence felt too heavy, too full of all the things they hadn't said. He glanced at her, taking in the sharp angles of her face, the way her violet eyes seemed to glimmer even in the dark. "You know, if you're so determined to keep me alive, you might want to tell me what we're really up against," he said, his tone light but probing. "You've been fighting them longer than I have. What are we running from?" Kira tilted her head back, staring up at the cracked ceiling. For a moment, Alec thought she wouldn't answer, but then she spoke, her voice quiet, as if the words cost her something to say. "The Syndicate's not just after me because I failed my mission," she admitted. "They're afraid of what I know about their plans, about their real goal with Earth." She turned her head, meeting his gaze with a piercing intensity. "They don't want alliances. They want control. They plan to destabilize your world, undermine its alliances with the Rayatari and others, so that when they strike, Earth will be too weak to resist." Alec felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had suspected the Syndicate's ambitions, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so calmly, made it feel real in a way that his diplomatic briefings never had. "Why tell me this now?" he asked, trying to read the shadowed emotions that flickered across her face. Kira's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Maybe I want you to understand what you're risking your life for. Or maybe I'm just tired of carrying this secret alone." Her voice softened, losing its usual edge. "It's strange, isn't it? All my life, I've been trained to obey, to never question. And now all I have are questions." Alec leaned closer, his voice gentle, despite the tension between them. "And what do you want, Kira? If the Syndicate falls, if you get away from all of this, what then?" She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for a moment, Alec saw a flicker of vulnerability that caught him off guard. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've never let myself think that far." Before he could respond, a sudden surge of pain crossed her face. Kira gasped, her hands flying to her abdomen, her body curling inward. Alec's heart jumped into his throat as he reached out, catching her before she could slump to the ground. "Kira, what's happening?" She gritted her teeth, her skin paling as she clutched her stomach. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and Alec felt a surge of panic as he realized that the blue veins along her arms were pulsing erratically, glowing with an unsettling light. It's not possible," she managed to choke out, her voice barely more than a rasp. "I shouldn't." Alec's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He gently lowered her to the ground, his hands shaking as he fumbled for a med scanner from his pack. But before he could activate it, Kira grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her obvious pain. Her eyes met his, wide and wild with confusion. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word, as if saying it out loud made it real. "And it's yours." Alec froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. For a moment he could only stare at her, trying to process the impossible. But as he took in the fear and confusion in her gaze, he forced himself to focus, his mind snapping back to the immediate danger. "We need to get you stable," he said, his voice firm, despite the pounding of his heart. "There has to be a medical bay in this place. We'll figure out the rest later." Kira nodded, but Alec could see the questions swirling behind her eyes, questions she didn't yet have the strength to voice. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they stumbled through the darkened halls, moving deeper into the bowels of the colony. As they reached the remnants of a medical ward, Alec couldn't help but feel the enormity of what lay ahead of the fragile, impossible life now caught between them. He glanced at Kira, at the fierce determination that still burned in her expression, despite the pain, and he felt a strange, fierce protectiveness take root in his chest. They had come to Arcus 9 seeking a temporary refuge, but what they had found instead was a new kind of fight, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. And as Alec guided Kira into the medical bay, he realized that, for the first time, they weren't just running from the past. They were running toward a future neither of them had ever imagined. The air in the medical bay was stale, tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic from years long past. The overhead lights flickered, casting uncertain shadows across the cold metal walls. Alec leaned over Kira, guiding her to the edge of an old examination table, the years of disuse creaking beneath her weight. Her face, usually so guarded and unreadable, was now pale and drawn, her violet eyes clouded with pain and confusion. Alec's hands shook as he activated the dusty med scanner, trying to steady his breath amidst the whirl of thoughts. Kira clutched her abdomen, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. Alec could see the faint glow that pulsed beneath her skin, lighting up the veins along her forearms, a strange, alien radiance that seemed to shift and dance beneath the surface. It was mesmerizing in its own unsettling way, but right now all Alec could focus on was the fear in her eyes. "How is this even possible?" Alec muttered, more to himself than to Kira, as he ran the med scanner over her. The device hummed to life, displaying streams of data that flickered across the screen in alien script interspersed with human diagnostics. He struggled to parse the information, but one fact was undeniable: a new life, a hybrid of human and alien, growing within her. Kira's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength, pulling him from his thoughts. "This shouldn't be happening," she whispered, her voice raw with disbelief. I wasn't made for this. They modified me, stripped away everything that made me like the others. I wasn't supposed to be capable of carrying life." Alec looked down at her, feeling a rush of something he couldn't quite name: sympathy, yes, but more than that. A fierce protectiveness that took him by surprise, mingling with the shock still reverberating through him. He knelt beside her, his expression softening as he searched her eyes, seeing the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "Whatever they did to you, Kira, they didn't take away your choice," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "We'll find a way to get through this. Together." Kira's gaze met his, and for a moment the fear in her eyes gave way to something warmer, something fragile and almost hopeful. But before she could respond, a harsh, metallic clang echoed through the hallways outside, cutting through the tense quiet. The sound reverberated through the medical bay, sending a jolt of alarm through Alec's chest. He straightened, reaching for the pistol holstered at his side, his muscles tensing. "They're here," Kira breathed, the fear in her voice morphing into something sharper: determination, the instincts of a soldier reasserting themselves. She slid off the examination table, steadying herself against the wall. "The Syndicate. They found us." Alec's jaw clenched, and he scanned the med bay, his mind racing through their limited options. He checked his pistol, making sure the energy cell was fully charged, then handed Kira a compact energy blade he had scavenged earlier, its handle worn, but still functional. She took the weapon with a nod, but her fingers brushed his briefly, a fleeting touch that carried a weight of unspoken words. "If they find out about the child, about this, they'll do worse than kill us," she said, her voice low and fierce. "They'll take me apart, find out how it happened, use it against Earth." Alec's blood ran cold at the thought. He reached out, cupping her face in one rough hand, forcing her to look at him. "I won't let that happen. Whatever it takes, I'll keep you both safe." Kira held his gaze for a moment, her eyes reflecting a mix of defiance and something that might have been gratitude. She pulled away, turning toward the door, her grip tightening around the energy blade. "Then we fight," she said simply, her voice taking on that hard, unyielding edge he had come to know. "Come on, let's give them a welcome they won't forget." Alec nodded, adrenaline surging through him as they slipped into the corridor, moving like shadows through the dilapidated halls of Arcus 9. The faint sound of Syndicate troops moving through the colony grew louder: metal boots, clanging against the steel floor, the murmur of voices distorted by helmets. Alec and Kira exchanged a brief, tense glance, then positioned themselves in a small alcove where the corridor curved, giving them a clear line of sight. They waited, muscles coiled, listening to the heavy footsteps drawing closer. Alec held his breath, counting the beats of his heart. When the first shadow appeared at the edge of the corridor, Kira struck with ruthless precision, lunging out of the darkness. Her energy blade ignited with a crackling hum, slicing through the Syndicate soldier's armor like paper. The body hit the ground before the others even registered what had happened. Alec followed her lead, raising his pistol and firing a quick succession of shots, the blue energy bolts searing through the dim light. He took down 2 more before they could react, but the rest of the squad snapped into action, returning fire with precision. Kira moved like a force of nature, her blade flashing through the air, her movements fluid and deadly. Alec covered her from behind, taking out targets with careful, calculated shots. But despite their skill, the Syndicate soldiers kept coming, pouring into the corridor like a tide, relentless and efficient. Kira. Fall back, Alec shouted over the roar of energy weapons, his voice hoarse with strain. He caught sight of her turning, her face glistening with sweat, but her eyes burned with that same fierce determination. Together, they retreated into the medical bay, barricading the door behind them with an overturned examination table and broken crates. For a moment, the door shuddered under the impact of Syndicate blasts, each hit reverberating through the walls. Alec and Kira exchanged a look, their breathing ragged, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Kira leaned heavily against the barricade, her hand going to her abdomen again, her expression tightening with pain. "They won't stop until we're both dead," she muttered, her voice strained, but Alec saw no fear there, only a grim acceptance. "They can't afford to let us leave this place alive." Alec's mind raced, searching for options, but he knew their chances were slipping away with each passing second. He glanced around the medical bay, his eyes falling on the terminal Kira had used earlier, the faint glow of its display screen, still flickering in the dim light. An idea took root, desperate and reckless. "We could use the terminal to override the power core's safety protocols," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "If we overload it, we can blow the entire docking bay, take out their ship with it." Kira's eyes widened, and for a moment he thought she might argue. But then she nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "It'll kill anyone still in the bay, including us if we don't get out in time." Alec forced a grim smile, knowing how slim their odds were. "Then we'd better move fast." Kira limped to the terminal, her movements stiff with pain, while Alec kept his pistol trained on the door, firing at the seams where the Syndicate soldiers tried to pry it open. He listened to the hurried clacks of Kira's fingers on the console, the hum of the power core rising in pitch as she bypassed the safety protocols. "Done," she called, and Alec grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the terminal. They ran together, bursting through a side exit just as the door behind them buckled inward under the pressure of the Syndicate's assault. The roar of the power core grew to a deafening pitch, the lights flickering wildly as they sprinted down the corridor toward the outer airlock. The first shockwave hit just as they reached the airlock, a rumble that sent them sprawling against the cold metal floor. Alec felt the heat of the explosion licking at their heels as he grabbed Kira's hand, dragging her through the airlock door. He smashed the release button, and the hatch slammed shut behind them with a bone-jarring clang. Outside, the docking bay erupted into a ball of fire and debris, the shockwave tearing through Arcus 9. The explosion lit up the darkness, casting flickering shadows across the crumbling walls as the Syndicate warship disintegrated in a blinding flare of light. The force of the blast sent tremors through the station, and Alec felt the air rush past them as the atmosphere vented into the void. He pulled Kira close, shielding her body with his as the station shuddered around them, metal groaning under the strain. The sound of the explosion echoed through the hollow corridors, fading into the silence of space. And then, finally, there was nothing but the heavy beat of their hearts, the rapid breaths they shared in the dark. Kira clung to him, her grip tight, her body trembling against his. Alec held her, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath her skin, the faint warmth of the impossible child they had conceived. For a moment, all the danger, all the uncertainty, melted away, leaving only the two of them, alive amidst the ruins. They were battered, bruised, but they had survived. Alec looked down at Kira, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face, seeing the weariness and relief that softened her features. "You did it," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You saved us." Kira met his gaze, and though her smile was faint, it was real, softening the sharp edges of her expression in a way that made Alec's chest ache. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. And for the first time, Alec felt a spark of hope flicker to life between them, fragile but unyielding. As they gazed out into the shattered remains of the docking bay, the stars beyond glittering against the darkness, they knew that the fight was far from over. The Syndicate would send more. They would face new threats, new dangers. But for now, in this brief, quiet moment, they had found something worth fighting for, a chance at a future, neither of them had believed possible. And as the silence of the void wrapped around them once more, Alec and Kira held on to that fragile hope, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The air inside Arcus 9 was thin, tinged with the metallic tang of burning circuitry and lingering smoke. Alec and Kira stumbled through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing through the skeletal remains of the station. They moved as one Alec's arm wrapped around Kira's waist, supporting her as they navigated the twisted wreckage of their recent battle. Her skin, usually vibrant with that deep, oceanic blue, was now pale, sweat beading along her brow as she fought through waves of pain. Alec glanced over at her, concern tightening his expression. The glow beneath her skin, those strange, pulsing veins that signaled the new life growing inside her, flickered erratically, like a dying star. He knew the signs from their hasty scan. Earlier her body was struggling to adapt, to accept the impossible reality of carrying a hybrid child. And now, with the Syndicate's attack leaving them battered and their ship's systems failing, time was running out. "Just a little further, Kira," he murmured, his voice barely more than a rasp. He wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. "The emergency shuttle bay isn't far." Kira's lips curled into a grimace, but she managed a faint nod, forcing herself to match his pace. "You always sound so sure of yourself," she whispered, a weak attempt at humor. Her breath hitched as another wave of pain racked through her, but she kept moving, leaning into Alec's strength. "I have to be, or I'd never convince you to follow my crazy ideas," he shot back, a ghost of a smile crossing his face despite the desperation clawing at his chest. He kept his arms steady around her, feeling the heat of her skin against his side as they moved together, step by step, through the broken halls. But even as they pressed on, Alec couldn't ignore the sense of urgency pressing against his ribs, the knowledge that the Syndicate wouldn't take long to realize that their forces had gone dark. More would come. He and Kira needed to be gone before then, or this temporary reprieve would turn into a death trap. They rounded a corner, and the emergency shuttle bay came into view, its reinforced doors a stark contrast to the crumbling infrastructure around them. Alec breathed a sigh of relief as he saw that the old docking system still had power barely. The terminal blinked with a weak, flickering light like a fading heartbeat. Alec hurried to the terminal, supporting Kira with one arm while he keyed in the access codes with the other. The heavy doors shuddered open, revealing a small, outdated escape shuttle nestled in the shadows of the bay. Its hull was scorched with rust, but the cockpit lights flickered to life when Alec powered it on, casting a dull glow across the bay. Kira let out a shuddering breath, her legs giving out beneath her as they reached the shuttle's hatch. Alec caught her before she fell, guiding her gently into the co-pilot's seat. Her head lolled back against the worn cushions, and for a moment, her eyes fluttered shut, the exhaustion overtaking her. Alec's chest tightened as he looked at her, seeing the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. He reached out, brushing a thumb across her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin, the slight tremble in her breath. "Hang on, Kira," he said softly, a promise wrapped in those simple words. "We're almost out of this." She opened her eyes, and for a moment her gaze held his, filled with something that Alec couldn't quite name: gratitude, fear, and the fragile hope that had begun to take root between them. She nodded, the movement small but determined, and Alec turned back to the controls, focusing on the task at hand. The shuttle's engines rumbled to life with a deep, guttural sound, shaking off years of disuse. Alec felt the vibrations thrumming through the hull as he guided the ship through the cracked bay doors, leaving the ruined skeleton of Arcus 9 behind. The view outside was stark. Debris still drifted through the void, remnants of the Syndicate's destroyed warship, its twisted metal glinting in the pale light of the distant gas giant. Alec set the autopilot for a distant, uncharted system, far beyond the Syndicate's usual patrol routes. It was a gamble heading into unknown space, but it was the only chance they had. If they stayed in known territory, the Syndicate would hunt them down, and there was no guarantee that Earth's allies would be willing to shelter them with the stakes as high as they were. As the shuttle slipped into warp, Alec turned back to Kira, the tension in his chest easing slightly. But he could still see the pain etched into her face, the way she clutched her abdomen, as if trying to hold herself together. He reached out, covering her hand with his own, offering a small, steadying pressure. "It's going to be okay," he said, trying to infuse his words with the certainty she needed. But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the questions gnawing at him, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, of how they would survive this journey into the unknown. Kira opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden jolt rocked the shuttle, wrenching them sideways in their seats. Alex's heart lurched as he saw the warning lights flash across the control panel. Proximity alert, something pulling them out of warp. He grappled with the controls, struggling to stabilize the ship as it tumbled through the ether, caught in the gravitational pull of a nearby celestial body. The shuttle lurched again, and then, with a bone-jarring thud, they broke through the turbulence, emerging into a strange, swirling nebula. Alex's breath caught as he took in the view through the cracked cockpit window. Clouds of iridescent gas swirling in shades of violet, gold, and sapphire, lighting up the darkness like a cosmic ocean. And at the heart of the nebula, a small, uncharted planet glowed with an emerald hue, shrouded in mist. Kira's eyes widened as she saw it, and Alec could almost see the wheels turning behind her gaze, the analyst's mind that had been trained to assess threats, to find angles. "It's untouched," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe. "No colonies, no syndicate beacons. It's hidden." Alec glanced at the readout's breathable atmosphere, temperate climate, an anomaly in the nebula's gravitational field that made it almost invisible to external scans. It was as if the universe itself had tucked this place away, keeping it secret from the prying eyes of those who sought to control the stars. "It's perfect," Alec said, the realization settling over him like a warm cloak. He looked back at Kira, seeing the hope flicker in her expression, tentative but real. "We can hide here, start over, they won't find us." For a moment, Kira seemed to struggle with the idea, her eyes clouded with doubt. But then she nodded, a small, determined movement, and Alec guided the shuttle into the planet's atmosphere, feeling the gentle pull of gravity draw them down into the swirling mists below. They touched down in a secluded valley, ringed by lush, alien foliage that glowed softly in the dim light of the nebula's glow. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the faint hum of unseen life. Alec helped Kira out of the shuttle, supporting her as they stepped onto the soft, moss-covered ground, feeling the weight of solid earth beneath their feet. For a moment they simply stood there, taking in the strange, ethereal beauty of this hidden world. Alec felt the tension in his shoulders ease as he breathed in the clean, untainted air, the sense of danger receding like a distant memory. Kira leaned against him, her body trembling with the effort of standing, but her eyes shone with a light he hadn't seen before, hope, fragile but growing. She placed a hand on her abdomen, feeling the gentle pulse beneath her skin, the life that defied all the odds. "Maybe. This place is a chance," she said softly, almost as if she didn't believe her own words. "A chance to be more than what they made me." Alec wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her against his side. "It's not just a chance, Kira," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. "It's a promise. For you, for the child, we'll build something new here, something the syndicate can't touch." Kira closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and Alec felt the tension in her body slowly melt away. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future beyond the blade, beyond the shadows that had shaped her. And in that quiet, shared moment, amidst the alien glow of the valley, something fragile but unbreakable grew between them. They worked together in the days that followed, repairing the shuttle, setting up a makeshift shelter, exploring the strange terrain that stretched out around them like a new frontier. Alec found himself drawn to the rhythm of this new life building, scavenging, sharing quiet meals with Kira beneath the sky lit by the swirling nebula. Kira's strength slowly returned, and with it, the glow beneath her skin stabilized, the pulse of new life growing steadier. She began to speak of her past more openly, of the homeworld she barely remembered, of the dreams that had once seemed impossible. Alec shared his own stories, of Earth's oceans and forests, of the life he had left behind. And as the days stretched into weeks, they found a new rhythm, a partnership that went beyond survival into something warmer, something that filled the empty spaces they had carried for so long. One evening, as they stood together on a ridge overlooking the valley, the sky painted with the colors of a dying star, Kira reached out, intertwining her fingers with Alec's. He turned to her, surprised by the softness in her touch, by the unguarded expression on her face. "We're not just running anymore, are we?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. Alec smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her grip, the quiet resolve that had carried them both through so much. "No," he replied, his voice steady. "We're building something. A future." Kira's gaze softened, and for a moment Alex saw a glimpse of the woman she had hidden beneath layers of fear and conditioning, a woman who was learning, for the first time, what it meant to choose her own path. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, and together, they watched the nebula swirl across the sky, carrying the promise of new beginnings. As the darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the twilight, Alec felt a sense of peace settle over him, deep and unshakable. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer assassin and diplomat, but partners, bound by the fragile, unbreakable hope that had taken root in this hidden corner of the universe. And as he held Kira close, feeling the gentle pulse of life between them, he knew that this was their new dawn, a future they would carve out of the stars together.